I never thought my family's farmhouse, a place full of innocent memories, could become the scene of something so forbidden. It started with just a lingering glance, then an unspoken tension, and before I knew it, everything I believed in was shattered. My son-in-law, charming, confident, and completely off-limits, stood too close, said too much, and left me questioning who I was. What happened that weekend would change all our lives forever. My name is Ava, and I'm 55 years old. A few years ago, I lost my husband, James, the love of my life. His passing left a void in me that I've been trying to fill ever since. The farmhouse, our little slice of heaven, was always a source of joy for us. It's where James and I spent countless summers together, laughing, dreaming, and building a lifetime of memories. But since his death, the farmhouse has fallen into neglect, much like the parts of my heart that once felt whole. Thankfully, I have my daughter, Mia, who has been my anchor through it all. She's 33 now, brilliant and compassionate, with a strength that amazes me every day. She's carved out a life for herself as a successful engineer, a field she's both passionate about and fiercely dedicated to. Watching her grow into the amazing woman she is has been my greatest joy. Mia's husband, Wesley, has always seemed like the perfect partner for her. He's 40, equally intelligent, and a picture of calm reliability. His presence is steady, comforting even, and he treats Mia like she's the center of his world. For the 5 years they've been married, I've only seen love and respect between them, a relationship that seemed untouchable, unshakable. A few weeks ago, I decided it was time to revisit the farmhouse. It had been too long since I'd been back, and I thought restoring the place would be a perfect project. Mia and Wesley offered to join me for a weekend getaway, a chance for us to bond as a family while fixing up the old property. I happily agreed, imagining a weekend of laughter, teamwork, and perhaps some closure. When they arrived, everything seemed normal. Mia, ever cheerful, was excited to dive into the project. Wesley, as usual, was polite and eager to help. The atmosphere was light-hearted, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe this weekend would be everything I hoped for. But life has a way of turning our expectations upside down. Beneath the surface of that cheerful family gathering, something was brewing, something subtle but undeniable. And as the weekend unfolded, the cracks in our perfect picture began to show. The weekend at the farmhouse started like any other family visit, simple, relaxed, and filled with casual conversation. But as the hours turned into days, I began to notice something that I couldn't quite explain. It started with Wesley. At first, it was just small things, a glance that lingered too long, a subtle shift in his tone when he spoke to me, or the way he seemed to be around me more than usual. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself I was overthinking. Wesley had always been polite and respectful, the perfect son-in-law. Why would I read anything more into his actions? But then there were moments that I couldn't ignore, like the way his hand lightly brushed against mine when he handed me tools as we worked on sanding the porch. Or the time he offered to help me clean the dusty bookshelves, standing so close that I could feel the warmth of his presence. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of spending more time together. But every time he smiled at me or said my name, there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just politeness or familial affection, it was something more, something I couldn't bring myself to name. The tension grew when we were alone in the kitchen one afternoon. Mia had gone outside to check on the garden, leaving Wesley and me to prepare tea. As I reached for the kettle, I felt him move closer, his arm brushing against mine. "You really know your way around here, don't you?" he said, his voice low and steady. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the moment. "Years of practice," I replied, focusing on the tray of glasses in front of me. But when I turned around, he was standing right there, too close, his eyes fixed on mine. "You're amazing, you know," he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a confession. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was racing, and for a split second, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. But before I could say anything, Mia's voice called out from outside, breaking the spell. Wesley stepped back, his expression unreadable, and I hurried to finish the tea. That night, I replayed the moments in my mind, questioning everything. Was I imagining it? Was it possible that Wesley, my son-in-law, was acting this way toward me? The thought made me feel both guilty and intrigued, a dangerous mix of emotions that kept me awake long into the night. The following day, things only got stranger. While Mia worked in the garden, Wesley found excuses to be near me. Whether it was holding the ladder while I cleaned the high shelves or helping me sort through old belongings, he was always there, watching, waiting, and making me increasingly uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us, and yet I didn't know how to confront it. Was I reading too much into his actions, or was there truly something unsaid between us? The tension between us felt like a storm brewing, and I was caught in the middle, unsure of which way to turn. As the weekend progressed, the cracks in our perfect family picture became impossible to ignore. Wesley's behavior was growing bolder, and I was running out of ways to dismiss it. The farmhouse, once a place of innocence and fond memories, had become the backdrop for something I could no longer control. By the third day at the farmhouse, the air between Wesley and me had become almost unbearable. The tension, once subtle and fleeting, had grown into something palpable, something neither of us could ignore, no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise. That morning, Mia announced she needed to drive into the city to pick up supplies for the garden. "I'll be back by evening," she said cheerfully, kissing Wesley on the cheek before heading out. As her car disappeared down the gravel driveway, the farmhouse fell silent. The stillness that followed felt heavy, like the universe itself was holding its breath. I tried to busy myself with small tasks, cleaning the living room and rearranging the old furniture. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Wesley was nearby watching me. And sure enough, I turned around to find him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed casually, but his gaze intense. "You shouldn't be doing all this alone," he said, stepping into the room. His voice was calm, but there was something else there, a softness, a familiarity that I didn't know how to respond to. "I've got it under control," I replied quickly, turning back to the fireplace where I was stacking logs for the evening fire. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, the weight of his presence pressing down on me. "I wasn't talking about the work," Wesley said quietly, his words lingering in the air like a challenge. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. When I turned to face him, he had taken a few steps closer, closing the distance between us. "Wesley," I started, my voice shaky. We shouldn't." "I know," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. "I know it's wrong. But Ava, I can't stop thinking about you." The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I tried to move, to say something, but before I could, Wesley reached out and gently touched my arm. The contact was electric, sending a shockwave through me that left me breathless. For a moment, I couldn't think, couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped, and all that existed was the space between us. "I don't know what's happening," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I think you do," Wesley replied, his hand sliding down my arm until it found mine. His touch was warm, steady, and completely disarming. "Ava, I've tried to fight this, but I can't. I'm drawn to you in a way I've never been to anyone else." His words should have horrified me, should have made me push him away. But instead, they awakened something inside me, a longing, a hunger I hadn't felt in years. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire. And yet, when Wesley leaned in, I didn't stop him. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself give in, if only for a moment. The kiss deepened, and all the tension, all the unspoken words between us, seemed to dissolve in that instant. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our faces inches apart. "This is crazy," I said, my voice trembling. "This can't happen." "I know," Wesley said, his forehead resting against mine. "But it already has." The rest of the day passed in a haze of stolen glances and lingering touches. Every moment we were alone felt like a spark waiting to ignite. And when the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the farmhouse, Wesley found me in the kitchen, where I was trying, and failing, to focus on preparing dinner. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and urgent. He stepped closer, his hands resting on the counter on either side of me, trapping me in place. "Ava, tell me to stop, and I will. But if you feel even a fraction of what I'm feeling..." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Wesley, this is wrong. We both know that." "But it doesn't feel wrong," he countered, his eyes searching mine. "It feels inevitable." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of something that could destroy everything I held dear. And yet, I couldn't seem to step back. As the evening wore on, the lines between us blurred further. And when Mia returned, her cheerful presence only made the guilt heavier, the tension sharper. I couldn't look her in the eye without feeling like a terrible person, and yet, I couldn't stop the fire that had been lit between Wesley and me. The day after Mia returned, the weight of my actions hung over me like a dark cloud. Every glance in her direction felt like a reminder of the line I had crossed, and every time Wesley was near, my pulse quickened despite my desperate attempts to maintain control. I spent the morning trying to avoid both of them, busying myself with chores around the farmhouse. But Wesley didn't make it easy. He found reasons to be near me, to brush past me, to speak words heavy with meaning even when others were around. Mia seemed oblivious, her cheerful demeanor a painful contrast to the storm raging inside me. That evening, Mia decided to take a long bath, exhausted from a day spent restoring the garden. She asked Wesley to help her with a list of items she wanted to order for the farmhouse, leaving him alone with me in the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth, but the tension between us made the space feel colder than ever. Wesley sat across from me, his eyes flicking to mine every few seconds. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice low. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied sharply, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. "What happened was a mistake, Wesley. It can't happen again." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Ava, you can't deny what's between us. I know you feel it too." I shook my head, standing abruptly to put more distance between us. "It doesn't matter what I feel. Mia, she's my daughter, Wesley. Your wife. This is wrong on every level." But before I could step away, Wesley was on his feet, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He grabbed my hand, forcing me to face him. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't been tearing myself apart over this? But no matter how much I try to push it away, I can't. And I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because they were true. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, the pull between us was undeniable. And in that moment, I hated myself for it. Just as I opened my mouth to respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. We jumped apart, panic flashing across both our faces as Mia entered the room, wrapped in a towel, her wet hair dripping onto the floor. "What's going on?" she asked, looking between us. Her expression was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just talking about the old furniture, and what we can do to fix it up." Mia raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Well, I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late, you two." As she left the room, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the reprieve was short-lived. Wesley turned to me, his expression conflicted. "This can't stay buried forever, Ava." "It has to," I snapped. "For Mia's sake, for all of our sakes. You need to let this go." He didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he nodded reluctantly. I left the room without another word, retreating to the safety of my bedroom, where I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. The following morning, Mia suggested a family breakfast outside, under the shade of the farmhouse's old oak tree. I agreed, hoping the sunlight and open air would dispel some of the suffocating tension. We set up a small table, and for a while, everything felt normal. Mia laughed, Wesley chimed in with his usual charm, and I almost believed we could move past this. Almost. As we ate, Mia mentioned that she needed to grab something from her car. She excused herself, leaving Wesley and me alone at the table. The silence between us was deafening. "I meant what I said," Wesley murmured, his eyes fixed on me. "I can't pretend this isn't real." Before I could respond, Mia's voice rang out, sharp and filled with disbelief. "What is this?" I turned to see her standing a few feet away, holding a small notebook in her hands. My heart sank as I recognized it immediately. It was my journal, the one I had foolishly used to pour out my thoughts about everything that had happened. "Mia," I started, rising from my seat. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "You wrote everything down, Mom. Every detail. How could you?" Her words were like a dagger to my heart. I tried to move toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping me. "And you," she said, turning to Wesley. Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "I trusted you. I thought you loved me." "Mia, I do," Wesley began, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare," she snapped. "Don't you dare try to justify this." The rest of the day passed in a blur of shouting, crying, and accusations. Mia packed her things, refusing to listen to either of us as we tried to explain. By the time the sun set, she was gone, leaving the farmhouse eerily silent. Wesley and I sat in the living room, the weight of our actions crushing us both. "We've destroyed everything," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hollow. "I never meant for this to happen. But it had. And now there was no going back." The farmhouse, once a place filled with laughter and cherished memories, now felt like a hollow shell. Mia's departure left an aching void, and the silence that followed was deafening. I spent hours sitting in the living room, staring at the fireplace, replaying every decision that led to this moment. The guilt weighed heavily on me, crushing my chest like a vice. Wesley, too, was a shadow of his former self. He stayed at the farmhouse for a few more days, trying to help clean up or tend to the garden, but his presence only added to the tension. We spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid anything that could reignite the turmoil. The air between us was thick with regret, yet neither of us dared to address it. What was there to say? Words couldn't undo the damage we had caused. Mia, on the other hand, completely cut us off. I tried calling her, leaving messages that went unanswered. Each day, without a response, felt like another piece of my heart breaking. I couldn't blame her. If I were in her shoes, I'd hate me too. I had betrayed her in the worst possible way, both as her mother and as someone she trusted. And Wesley? He was no longer the devoted husband she once admired. We had shattered her world, and there was no way to undo it. The days turned into weeks, and the farmhouse became a place of isolation. Wesley eventually left, saying he needed to give Mia space and figure out what to do next. I didn't stop him. His presence only reminded me of my failures. As I watched him drive away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The connection we had once shared now felt like a burden, a reminder of the chaos we had unleashed. Alone at the farmhouse, I tried to find solace in the routine of daily chores. I cleaned, repaired, and tended to the garden, but nothing could distract me from the gnawing guilt. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of Mia's tear-streaked face and the sound of her voice cracking as she confronted us. One evening, I decided to write her a letter. I poured my heart into it, apologizing for everything, my weakness, my selfishness, and the pain I had caused. I told her I didn't expect forgiveness, but I wanted her to know how much I loved her, how deeply I regretted betraying her trust. I sealed the letter and mailed it the next morning, unsure if she'd ever read it. A few days later, Wesley called. His voice was weary, heavy with the same guilt that consumed me. "I haven't heard from her," he admitted. "I don't think she'll ever forgive us." "I wouldn't blame her if she didn't," I replied. "We've ruined everything, Wesley." "We made a mistake," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Ava." His words sent a chill through me. Even now, after all the damage we had done, he couldn't let it go. "Wesley, we can't do this anymore," I said firmly. "Mia deserves better than this. She deserves to have her life back, without us in the way." He was silent for a moment before sighing. "You're right. I don't know how to fix this." "Neither do I admitted. "But we have to try for Mia's sake." In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding myself. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could try to learn from it. I started attending therapy, seeking help to understand why I had allowed myself to cross such a forbidden line. The sessions were painful, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd long ignored, but they were necessary. Months passed before I heard from Mia. Her voice on the other end of the phone was hesitant, guarded. "I got your letter," she said simply. Tears welled up in my eyes. "Mia, I'm not ready to forgive you," she interrupted, her tone firm. "But I wanted you to know I'm okay." Hearing her say those words was a small relief, but the pain in her voice was still evident. "I understand," I said softly. "And I'll wait as long as it takes. I love you, Mia." There was a pause before she responded. "I need time." "I'll give you all the time you need," I promised. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen, holding the phone tightly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Months turned into a year, and while life didn't return to what it once was, I began to rebuild in small ways. The farmhouse became my sanctuary again, but not in the way it had been before. Instead of a place filled with happy memories, it became a space for reflection, healing, and learning to accept the consequences of my actions. Mia and I remained distant, though she called occasionally. Each conversation was brief, guarded, and tinged with the unspoken tension of unresolved pain. I didn't push her for forgiveness. I knew it was something I'd have to earn, if I could earn it at all. The wounds I had inflicted on her trust and her heart ran deep, and I didn't expect them to heal overnight. Therapy became a cornerstone of my life. Through countless sessions, I began to understand the loneliness and vulnerability that had led me to make such devastating choices. Losing James had left a void in me, and instead of confronting my grief, I had allowed it to fester. Wesley's attention had filled that void momentarily, but it was a hollow and destructive comfort. The price of that comfort, I learned, was far greater than I ever imagined. As for Wesley, he reached out a few times after leaving the farmhouse, but I made it clear that we couldn't continue to be in contact. We've caused enough damage, I told him during our last phone call. If you truly care about Mia, you'll focus on making things right with her. He agreed, though reluctantly, and after that, I didn't hear from him again. I didn't need to. Whatever connection we had shared was tainted by the harm it had caused, and there was no path forward for us. Not without destroying what little chance Mia had at healing. Over time, I began to find peace in small moments. Watching the sunrise over the fields, tending to the flowers Mia had planted before everything fell apart, and taking long walks through the woods reminded me that life could continue, even after devastating mistakes. I poured my energy into restoring the farmhouse, not just for myself, but as a symbol of the rebuilding I was trying to do within. One day, while sorting through some old photographs, I came across a picture of Mia as a child, sitting on James's shoulders and laughing. It struck me then how much I had failed her, not just as a mother, but as a protector of the values James and I had tried to instill in her. That realization became my guiding force. I couldn't undo the past, but I could strive to be the mother Mia deserved moving forward. Months later, Mia surprised me by visiting the farmhouse. She didn't come with forgiveness, but she came with a willingness to talk. Sitting on the porch, she told me how betrayed she had felt, how shattered her world had become. I listened without interruption, tears streaming down my face as she finally voiced the pain I had caused. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm tired of holding on to this anger. It's exhausting." "I'll never stop being sorry, Mia," I replied. "And I'll never stop trying to make things right, even if that means just giving you space." Her response was quiet but filled with meaning. "Maybe we can start with this," she said, gesturing to the farmhouse around us. "Fixing this place like we talked about before, everything happened. It was a small step, but it was more than I could have hoped for." Over the following weeks, we worked side by side, repairing the cracks in the farmhouse and, slowly, the cracks in our relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Looking back now, I see that betrayal doesn't just break trust, it breaks people. But in the rubble of what's destroyed, there's an opportunity to rebuild, to reflect, and to grow. I lost so much because of my choices, but I also learned lessons I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Temptation is fleeting, but the consequences can last forever. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to restore, but not entirely. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that love in all its forms requires integrity, patience, and a willingness to face the darkest parts of ourselves. And sometimes the hardest thing we can do is forgive ourselves. If you were in Mia's shoes, could you ever forgive such a betrayal? Or if you were Ava, how would you make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of relationships and choices. And stay tuned, because the next story will leave you just as speechless.